Have you heard about the crash of a 1-year-old TBM 960 at Truckee, California last weekend? The pilot, by all accounts, was well-trained and experienced in the aircraft, yet apparently lost control during the missed approach. I'll explain what we know from ADS-B data, and I have some recommendations for Garmin and Daher, and for pilots using an autopilot with an advisory glide slope. And during my updates, I'll tell you about the factory tour I took last week of Robinson Helicopter. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books, and I'm the 2008 National CFI of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week, we talked about sleep inertia and false glide slopes, both of which played significant roles in an Air India Express accident. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/321. And if you're new to the show, welcome. Glad to have you here. Now, if you would take just a second and go ahead and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show, supported by people like you, and that we have several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via your choice of PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, or Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news for the week of April 1, 2024, there may be changes in the way that the FAA handles some pilot mental health issues. The FAA has just issued a slew of new ACS documents that govern the way check rides are conducted. And we'll tell you about a one-of-a-kind aviation business in the U.S. that the FAA just shut down because they say it puts the public at risk. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, Mental Health Committee says pilots shouldn't have to report talk therapy sessions. An expert committee formed by the FAA on pilot mental health is recommending that pilots be allowed to get talk therapy from mental health professionals without having to disclose it in their flight medical. The Aviation Medical Clearances Rulemaking Committee has submitted its 69-page report to the agency, and its first recommendation of 24 is aimed at eliminating the fear pilots have of losing their tickets due to actually trying to fix a medical problem. As it stands, pilots with the kind of struggles that about 50% of all people face in their lifetime have three basic options: get help and risk their certificates, lie about getting help and risk losing their certificates, and not getting help to avoid that risk. The committee says the FAA operates on the assumption that those who seek non-pharmacological help with mental health may not be safe to fly. Quote, however, not only is there limited data to support this view, but there is also robust data to the contrary, the report says. It says simply talking to someone shouldn't be a reporting requirement. There are also recommendations to find non-punitive pathways for pilots seeking help for depression, anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and revised training for AMEs. The agency announced it has received the report but didn't comment on its contents. From jasonblair.net, updated ACS and PTS documents available, effective May 31st, 2024. Jason writes that the FAA published on April 1st, and no, this is not an April Fool's story, the much-awaited updated Airman Certification Standards, or ACS, and Practical Test Standards for numerous certification tests. Applicants, CFIs, and DPEs are encouraged to become familiar with the updated and new documents for upcoming testing activities. The documents are available for review now, but do not become effective immediately. The testing standards will become effective as of May 31st, 2024. All tests after that day will be conducted in accordance with the new standards. And I've looked through the list, and there are new ACSs that replace the existing PTS for the Flight Instructor Certificate and for the Helicopter, Private Helicopter, Commercial, and Helicopter Instrument Ratings, and a number of existing ACSs, including the Airplane Commercial and Airplane Instrument Rating, have been updated from their earlier ACS versions. And we'll talk more about these changes on an upcoming show. From generalaviationnews.com, Cessna 172 damaged by jet blast. And this comes from an NTSB final report. The student pilot and CFI taxied the Cessna 172 and stopped short of the displaced threshold runway behind a Bombardier Challenger, awaiting their clearance for departure from Van Nuys Airport in California. A witness stated that the Cessna was about 2 wingspans behind the Challenger and was in line with the jet thrust vector. Shortly after the pilot of the Challenger was cleared for takeoff, while still on the taxiway with brakes applied, he increased the engine power to about 80 to 90%, then released the brakes and departed. The CFI and the Cessna reported that he cut the mixture and deflected the aileron controls toward the Challenger's jet blast, but the plane lifted and the left wing was substantially damaged when it hit the runway. The Challenger pilot reported that he was not aware of anything unusual related to his takeoff, as he was not contacted by the local air traffic control tower. Probable cause, the student pilot's failure to maintain sufficient distance behind a jet airplane, which resulted in his loss of airplane control due to the jet airplane's jet blast and the CFI's delayed remedial action. And I think this just points out that you should always think about the spacing between you and the aircraft in front of you when you are lining up on the taxiway before takeoff. From GeneralAviationNews.com, Hartzell Aviation rolls out FAA safety tip videos. Hartzell has released a series of firewall-forward safety tip maintenance training courses covering a variety of Hartzell products, including on 4 popular aircraft, the Cirrus SR-22T, Beech Bonanza, Piper Seminole, and Vans RV-8. The videos qualify for FAA credit when logged into and enrolled in the FAAsafety.gov website after successfully completing the course material, according to company officials. The videos are conducted by a team representing 3 Hartzell Aviation companies, and those are Hartzell Propeller, Hartzell Engine Tech, and Hartzell Aerospace Welding. And I viewed part of the Cirrus SR-22T video that includes some good pre-flight information for pilots. From ByDanJohnson.com, Good Neighbor, How Sling Pilot Academy Made Their Trainer Whisper. Sling Pilot Academy found that the Rotax 912IS engines in their aircraft were particularly noisy. SPA is located at Torrance, California, an airport that has grown to become a training behemoth with their fleet flying more than 4,000 hours per month, the bulk of it in the Sling 2-place LSA it uses as a primary trainer. And Torrance, like many urban airports, faces increasing complaints from non-pilot neighbors. Sling began working on solutions to make the whole installation, both the Rotax and the Sling, less annoying. Quote, "We know that many aircraft have low-frequency sound, but ours were being perceived as being buzzy like a mosquito." After significant study, Sling realized that it wasn't just the higher frequency sound the combination produces, but that it wavered as well, like the sound of acoustics and the Rotax's high RPM nature. And they had to get on with a solution because they were adding 30 airplanes this year and already have 40 in the fleet. The first thing they tried was the exhaust. They added an off-the-shelf glass muffler that made a huge difference in the sound. Then they realized you have to either add length or change the direction to reduce noise. Eventually, the company settled on a configuration that reduces noise by 10 dBA using a long pipe that extends beneath the cabin and exits beneath the wing with a distinctive kick-up. That kick-up helps place the exhaust in the wake of the wing and aims it away from neighbors on the ground. But it's also effective in other directions. If you were to stand behind the airplane with the engine fully revved up, you cannot hear the exhaust. All you hear is the propeller and prop wash. Surprisingly, the system appears to actually improve the Sling's performance. The company assumes that the stock Sling-built exhaust actually had too little back pressure, and so the new quieter system gives the Rotax more of what it needs. Altogether, the modifications add about 10 pounds to the Sling 2-seater. Testing will continue through spring and summer of 2024. From AOPA.org, Icon Aircraft files for bankruptcy and seeks buyer. Icon Aircraft, which delivered its first amphibious Lightsport A5 in the summer of 2016, petitioned for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Delaware, where the company with operations in California and Florida is incorporated, on April 4th. The company issued a news release reporting the bankruptcy filing and that it intends to continue operations while the process unfolds. The company said it seeks to sell the business to new owners using Section 363 of the Bankruptcy Code, which could enable the buyer to take ownership free and clear of any liens. According to the petition, Icon owes $68 million to the company's 30 largest creditors. According to data compiled by the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Icon has delivered 209 aircraft since the first A5 was sold in 2016 through the end of 2023. While the company did not report billing revenue in the Gamma reports prior to 2022, total revenue for that year was $12.9 million with 36 aircraft delivered, dropping to $12.6 million for 2023 with 33 aircraft delivered. From Yahoo.com, American Airlines pilot arrested before flight for suspected intoxication. An American Airlines co-pilot was arrested prior to a flight on Saturday for suspected intoxication. The pilot failed a breathalyzer test and his blood alcohol content was over the legal limit for a pilot, ABC News reported, citing Michael Conway, Director of Public Affairs at the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The flight, which was scheduled to travel from Detroit to Philadelphia, was canceled. In a statement, American Airlines said, quote, "This is a serious matter, and we are assisting local law enforcement and the FAA with the investigation. We will handle this matter appropriately as the safety and care of our customers and employees is our highest priority." And finally, from SeattleTimes.com, in an article written by Dominic Gates, FAA halts Squim wing walking flights, revokes pilot certificate. The Mason wing walking business in Squim, Washington, that allowed paying thrill seekers to clamber over the wings of a 1940s Stearman while in flight is no more. The FAA has revoked the pilot certificate of Mike Mason, who flew wing walking flights for the past 12 years in Squim in summer and in California in the winter. The agency wrote in a March 18th letter to Mason, quote, "The administrator has determined that an emergency exists related to safety in air commerce and that immediate action to revoke your ATP certificate is required. Mason was barred from piloting any plane effective immediately." In an interview last August, Mason claimed that an FAA inspector had given him the all-clear to conduct wing-walking flights when he started flying them in 2012. He said he was assured he was exempt from the standard regulations governing commercial air carriers under rules specific to flight school, aerobatic, and aerial photography missions. The FAA said at the time that it was investigating this claim. This emergency order of revocation letter to Mason cites the outcome. During these flights, each lasting about 25 minutes and costing from $1,000 to $1,400 for the thrill ride, the wing walker climbed out of the cockpit, tethered to a cable at about 3,500 feet up. He or she strapped into a harness on a fixed rig, standing atop the wings as the bright red biplane performed aerobatics, including flipping upside down so that the person's head pointed straight down at the ground. The FAA investigation determined that those flights were, quote, reckless so as to endanger the life or property of another. The letter states that in addition to operating his business without authorization, Mason violated air safety regulations by performing aerobatic flight maneuvers when the paying passenger had no parachute. Mason has appealed the FAA action, though he remains barred from flying during the appeal process. In the U.S., professionals perform wing walking at some small air shows, but Mason's operation was the only way for a member of the public to sign up for such a ride. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later, we'll talk about the crash of a TBM 960 at Truckee, California last weekend. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to George Schumann on passing his instrument rating. He wrote, "Max, I want to thank you for all the training I've received over the years from your podcast. I passed my IFR check ride, and I credit much of the practical good habits, in capital letters, I have from the excellent teaching qualities you practice on your show. I soloed 26 years ago in Hollister, California, and have been hooked ever since. Thanks again." Well, congratulations, George. And if you've recently passed a check ride, go ahead and go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and send me a note, and we'll share that with everyone who listens. Now, in a moment, I'll tell you all about my tour of the Robinson Helicopter Factory, which was really cool. And after that, we'll dive into the many details of the TBM accident at Truckee last weekend. And toward the end of that, I'll tell you about some of the gotchas of flying an approach that has an advisory glide slope, but also some of the workarounds that you can use to help with those gotchas. But first, I wanted to ask for your help. This is a listener-supported show, and it's really the support from people such as you that lets me take time away from teaching, which is my main job, to spend time researching and producing the show for you. For example, this week, I probably spent over 20 hours just researching the details that we'll discuss shortly about the TBM accident. But this is also around the first of the month, and that's the time when, unfortunately, we lose about a half dozen supporters or more because their credit cards expire, and most of them don't take the time to update their cards. So I really love it when people do update their cards. So we're constantly in need of new people who haven't supported the show in the past just to stay even and to offset the people we lose each month when their cards expire. So I'd like to invite you to join the club and become part of our community that makes this all possible. And it's easy to do. All you need to do is just pull over to the side of the road now, stop the car. I'm joking. You can do this later. And go on out to the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And there you'll find 5 different ways that you can donate to support the show. And of course, when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your help. And now let me tell you about my factory tour of Robinson Helicopter at the Torrance, California Airport last week. I was in Southern California attending USC's Helicopter Accident Investigation course, and the tour was part of that course. And I loved it, by the way. But then again, I love factory tours. My first job at Hewlett-Packard was in the marketing department at one of their factories, and I always enjoyed walking around and seeing the various assembly equipment and processes there. Since that time, I've toured the Piper factory in Florida, Cessna Piston Factory in Independence, Kansas, the Sears Factory in Duluth, Minnesota, and the Continental Engine Factory in Mobile, Alabama. And I just have great admiration for people like Frank Robinson, who were able to both design products and create the processes and train workers to build these products. Hard to believe, but the first R-22 was shipped 45 years ago. Since then, they've built about 5,000 of them. Though these days, they ship perhaps only 15, 20 R-22s per year. The bulk of their sales are now in various versions of the R-44 and of the turbine-powered R-66. We learned that to date they've built about 3,000 Raven 1, 5,000 Raven 2 versions of the R-44, and about 1,400 R-66 helicopters. All told, they've shipped nearly 15,000 helicopters. But what impressed me most about the company was their approach toward constant innovation, which is reminiscent of the strategy used by many high-tech companies. For example, the company noted in their early days that there had been a number of post-crash fires of their helicopters. So they designed a crash-resistant bladder to fit inside their existing fuel tanks. Now, that did add a little weight and some cost to the design and slightly reduce the total fuel capacity. But we were told that since they switched over to these tanks, there hasn't been a single fire in a survivable crash. They originally offered these bladders as a retrofit to existing owners, and they offered it at a low cost so that most of the fleet was retrofitted. After 12 years of offering the fuel bladders at a discounted price, they increased the price to a market price. More recently, Robinson studied how they could reduce the incidence of low-G situations that can lead to mass bumping and downing of their helicopters. Now, mass bumping is a phenomenon that's particular to two-blade helicopters, and the U.S. Army dealt with it for many years in the UH-1 Huey helicopter. It's more likely to occur in turbulence when a helicopter is flying at higher speeds. After several years of design and testing, the company came out with a redesigned empennage that was rolled out on all new R-44 helicopters last year. Instead of a horizontal stabilizer that protruded on just one side of the helicopter, the new design features a symmetric horizontal stabilizer that sticks out equally on both sides of the helicopter. It's also available as a retrofit kit to existing owners and is being offered at a discount through the end of 2024. One thing I learned is that each helicopter they build contains about 5,000 parts, and the company builds over 80% of those parts themselves. One of the first parts we saw was the rotor hub, which connects the main rotor blades to the mast. It starts as a large block of forged aluminum that they get from an outside supplier. Robinson then mills it out to a final rotor hub. I picked one up, and it was surprisingly light. And while most of the metal pieces we saw were forgings, there were some castings, such as the tail rotor gearbox, which is relatively small and light. There were also many CNC and milling machines in the area. They also had a high-pressure water cutter for cutting aluminum sheet metal. They'd put in 10 sheets of aluminum at a time and cut through all of them simultaneously. One of the most interesting parts was the mast, which starts out as about a 6-foot-long bar of solid steel. It's then drilled from both ends to hollow it out, and then it's threaded on one end. I picked one up, and it was surprisingly light, weighing perhaps a little over 30 pounds. There's a separate shaft which passes through the mast and rotates within it to turn the main rotor blades. We saw the masts and shafts at different points in the production process as different treatments were applied to strengthen the metal. We also saw the empty helicopter cabins. These were made almost completely of fiberglass and were so light that two people could easily pick up the whole cabin. We also saw the custom steel jigs that were made to hold the cabins, as sheet metal was applied to them and riveted in place. We also saw the manufacture of the main rotor blades. They started with the blade grip, which is a cylindrical piece of forged aluminum that connects into the rotor hub. A main spar is then attached to the blade grip, and then a very long piece of aluminum is wrapped around the spar. They then glue the trailing edges of the aluminum together and then put the entire blade assembly into an autoclave. Later we saw where they did static balancing of each blade by adding washers just inside the tiny caps at the far end of each blade. Now, the noisiest part of the entire factory was one guy who was filing down the edges of the main rotor blades. The blades were inserted into a jig, and then he just filed them down to the edges of the jig. And I believe they said that the rotor blades were originally wrapped in steel, but that they found that aluminum was less likely to dent from bird strikes and things like that. And I think they said the main rotor blades are rated for 2,200 hours or 12 years, whichever comes first. They also build all of their own wiring harnesses. To do this, they use wiring boards that are mounted vertically, and these have a sheet of paper on it that shows where all of the wires and connectors should go. When they're done, they test for continuity and shorts. There were also some newer wiring boards that were large computer displays, which makes it easier to update the boards with the design changes. Also, the new wiring boards take less space, which is important because the old-style wire boards required lots of space to store. Interestingly, they keep all of the old boards so that they can go back and build a correct cable for an older aircraft if needed. And I was intrigued to see the Rolls-Royce 300 turbine engine that goes into the R-66. It's surprisingly small and weighs only about 200 pounds, or about half the weight of the Lycoming engines that go into the R-44. And that weight savings helps tremendously in improving the useful load of the R-66 versus the R-44. Later, we walked through the final assembly area. There was just one station for the R-22 since they build relatively few of them, but I counted 8 assembly stations for the R-44s and R-66s, and the airframe would be moved manually from one station to the next as work was completed. A surprising number of these stations are devoted to installing wiring and avionics. At one station, we saw the workers testing the main rotor hydraulics. As one person moved the cyclic control in a box pattern, 2 people on top of the helicopter were watching the corresponding movement of the 3 hydraulic servos that control the position of the main rotor blades. There's a tubular steel structure that extends from the cabin back to the beginning of the tail cone and supports all of the major components, including the engine. I was surprised to see that structure being welded by hand. I guess I thought that the welding would be automated, but then again, helicopters are built in small quantities compared to the large number of cars that are manufactured where you might see robotic welding systems. After the assembly, the helicopters go into the paint shop. Now, this was a large enclosed structure within the factory that had doors on both ends. At one end, helicopters went in. After they were painted, they were moved through an internal door to the second half of the enclosure, which was the paint drying booth. When the paint was dry, they came out the far end of the enclosure. The helicopters then moved to the flight test area, which was the only place where we were allowed to take photos. Here they do all of the final rigging of the helicopter. To figure out what further trimming of the blades is required, they attach a sensor to the bottom of the scissors plate to measure, I'm guessing, vibration of the main rotor. Then they figure out what further trimming of the blade is required. Finally, they weigh the aircraft so that it can be certified and then do flight testing of the helicopter. And if the helicopter is to be shipped overseas, it's then moved to the export area. There they remove the rotor blades, the engine, the gearbox, and they put everything into a wooden box. And there were a couple of fun stories I want to share. One was that the length of the R-22's tail rotor blade was set by the maximum length that could be accommodated by Frank Robinson's wife's oven, which reminds me of a similar story I heard when I was at HP, which was that the front panels of the first instruments the company built were baked in the founder's wife's oven. Another story had to do with the length of the segments that are assembled together to form the tail boom. Apparently, Frank Robinson dictated that the segments were to be short enough so that you could reach through with your arm to the end of the segment, which makes a lot of sense, both for initially assembly and later for service and support. We also learned that the R-22 tail rotor blades rotate in a different direction than the tail rotor of the R-44 and R-66. If you look at an R-22 from the side, the forward portion of the tail rotor rotates down away from the main rotor. However, it turns out that a tail rotor is more effective if it rotates in the opposite direction with the forward portion of its blade moving up toward the main rotor. And that's because it benefits from the downwash from the main rotor blade, which allows the tail rotor to be more effective. All in all, it was a fabulous visit, and it's a fine testimony to the work of Frank Robinson and the 1,300 employees of the company. By the way, I did find a video online that shows a factory tour, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes so that you can see many of the things I've talked about. And aviation is a small community, so see if you know any of these people who've signed up to support the show over the last 3 to 4 weeks. Sorry, I didn't have time to read these when I was way down in Southern California, so we'll do a little catch-up here. First, special thanks to our new mega supporter. These are the folks that do the heavy lifting and donate $50 a month. Thank you to Jeff Noizou. Other new supporters on Patreon, thanks to George Shubin, Scott Porter, Ken Juster, and David, who increased his support level. And special thanks to these people who've made one-time donations on Venmo: Joey Weiss, Calvin Fabra, Carl Waymeyer, and Randy Doroff. We also had some one-time donations via PayPal, thanks to Jan Crauer and Chuck Kelly. And finally, we had a one-time donation via Zelle. Thanks so much to David Chelensky, who writes, "I've been a CFI since 2015, and I'm writing to express my sincere gratitude for your podcast over the years. Your dedication and willingness to share your knowledge with others has made your episodes necessary, quote, continuing education classes for me as I endeavor to keep up with the latest trends and topics in aviation. I'm grateful to hear the advice, tips, and tricks of a seasoned instructor," I think that means old, "who has been there and done that. You don't always find that in aviation podcast. Thank you so much for your time, effort, and energy that you put into making the aviation community a better place to be." And David is a flight instructor at St. Louis University. Thanks so much. And also thanks to Jeff Shirazi, who writes, "We enjoy your perspective," and Jeff is from Ohio. Coming up next, we'll talk about the TBM accident at Truckee, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about the fatal crash of November 960 Lima Papa, an almost new TBM 960 turboprop that crashed this past weekend while flying a missed approach at Truckee, California. First, my condolences to the friends and family of the pilot. This was a tragic accident that appears to have been avoidable. And of course, the reason pilots are talking about this accident and other accidents is so that we can learn from it and hopefully avoid having a similar accident in the future. Let me say at the outset that from what I've read and heard about the pilot, he was by all accounts well-trained and experienced in the aircraft. So that begs the question, how did we end up with a crash with an experienced pilot in one of the most capable turboprop aircraft? The preliminary NTSB report is not out yet, but we already have a lot of data. And it appears there was what some, though not all pilots would agree, was a significant decision-based error, which we'll talk about, though oddly it probably won't be included in the NTSB's probable cause. And there were multiple skill-based errors, one of which will almost certainly be in the probable cause. And as you listen, please don't be thinking, that accident could never happen to me. It is tempting to think that, but under the right circumstances, it could. And if the accident pilot were alive today and could read about this accident, he might say, this accident would never happen to me. Yet it did. And under the right circumstances, you or I could also make one of these same mistakes. One key takeaway from the Aviation Human Factors course I took at USC 2 weeks ago is that all pilots, no matter how good we are, make mistakes. Since we can't eliminate mistakes, we need to develop strategies for detecting errors, recovering from errors, and building lots of margin into every aspect of our flying so that one error won't cause us to crash. Note, this is much harder to do in a single pilot environment versus with a two-pilot crew. RC pilots who fly model aircraft have an expression in their hobby that captures this well. They say that when you fly, you want to keep your model plane 2 mistakes high, which means flying with enough altitude to recover from 2 independent mistakes. And we need to apply similar principles when flying airplanes and build extra safety margin into every aspect of our flying, because you know that you'll make at least one mistake on every flight, and you'll want to be able to recover from that mistake no matter what it is. Let me talk first about the flight, and as I do, think about any errors or risk factors that you hear. Afterwards, we'll talk about the many factors involved in this accident. The aircraft was delivered to the owner in late December of 2022, about 15 months before the crash. I looked at FlightAware.com and counted about 86 flights in the past 12 months, many of them longer flights across the country and even one to Mexico. So it's apparent that the owner had well over 100 hours in this aircraft. And I've heard that this was the pilot's second TBM, so he clearly was familiar with the aircraft type. He was apparently based in Truckee, as the aircraft is registered to an address in Incline Village, Nevada, 25 minutes from the airport. And Incline Village is also about a 45-minute drive from the Reno-Tahoe International Airport. The flight originated from KAPA, the Centennial Airport, located south of Denver. The entire flight lasted about 3 hours and 15 minutes. When the aircraft departed Centennial, the weather at Truckee was reported to be 1/2 mile visibility in snow and 600 feet overcast. The next report, issued soon after takeoff, was 2.5 miles visibility in light snow, with clouds broken at 2,000 and 2,900 feet overcast, which would have been encouraging to the pilot. The Truckee Airport has a number of challenges, and later we'll talk about the accident rate at this airport. The airport field elevation is about 5,900 feet, and the airport has higher terrain in all directions, so you can think of it as being in a bowl. Because of the terrain, the instrument approaches going into this airport have higher minimums than at most airports. There are just 3 approaches into the airport. The RNAV GPS Alpha comes in from the west and has only circling minimums since it leaves you too high above the airport. The Category B minimums, the ones I'd use for a TBM, are 7,500 feet, about 1,600 feet AGL, and 1.5 miles visibility. So you'd only use that approach if you were coming in from the west and the ceilings were high. The RNAV GPS 11 approach, which I've flown before, is a straight-in approach, but it has even higher minimums. The Category B minimums are 7,720 feet, which is over 1,800 feet AGL, and 1.5 mile visibility. The approach with the lowest minimums, which the accident pilot flew, is the RNAV GPS 20. This approach has LP minimums, and its final approach course comes in at a 14.5 degree angle to the runway. For Category A and B aircraft, the lowest minimums are 6,480 feet, or 582 feet AGL, and 1 mile visibility. Having the runway come in at an angle creates an odd problem when you're on short final. The missed approach point, Winub, is located 0.8 miles before you get to the runway. At that point, you are roughly on the runway centerline. But if you continue to fly the approach beyond the missed approach point, you'll progressively track further and further to the left of the runway. By the time you reach the runway threshold, you'll be about 0.2 of a mile left of the runway, which is indeed the track this aircraft followed. The approach also has a VDP, or visual descent point, located 0.7 nautical miles before the missed approach point. A VDP is the point where a normal descent path, typically a 3-degree angle, intercepts the MDA altitude. So in this case, when you're at 1.5 miles from the runway, if you have the runway in sight, you can visually begin a normal 3-degree descent to the runway. Note that if the visibility is at the 1 mile minimums, you won't see the runway until you're a 1/2 mile beyond the VDP, and you may end up landing a little long. If there's a visual glide slope available, such as a VASI, you can follow that guidance to the runway. At Truckee, there is a VASI for runway 20, but at the time of the accident, it was NOTAMed out of service. Significantly, there are no approach lighting systems to any of the runways at Truckee. So in low visibility, the only visual aids for helping to spot the runway are the runway lights. And note that these are LED lights, so they don't generate the same heat as the older incandescent runway lights, so they don't do as good a job of melting any snow that's accumulated on the lights. There was a significant storm cell in the vicinity of Truckee, and the controller discussed this with the pilot. This comes from liveatc.net, and for whatever reason, part of the transmission was cut off, but this is what the controller told the pilot.
Go at your 1 o'clock in about 40 miles, a pretty large band of moderate precipitation. So I was going to leave you on that heading for about 10 more minutes, and then I can bring you in. We can do the RNAV 11 if you want. We can do the RNAV 20. Either way, we could go Alpha. We could go start from the east point, Woodpa. All those would be fine.
The pilot then responded, though we can't hear his response on the recording. Here's what the controller then said after his response.
Mr. Lane was off. Okay. Yeah, well, but you can plan for Alpha. I think once you're over the lake and you look at where Woodpa is, it looks, on mine it looks good. I think it's just in between you and Woodpa. If you went straight to it, you wouldn't be happy going straight at it. But from the angle, we'll bring you to the south. I think you might like it. But we can always change our minds. We'll plan for Alpha.
It's possible there was some icing in the clouds, though the nearest PIREP for icing was over 100 miles away. But still, it was probably a factor in the pilot's mind, as when he was initially instructed to descend, he apparently asked to remain at his cruise altitude longer, and ATC allowed this. Later, he was given a descent to flight level 220 at pilot discretion, which would allow him to stay above any icing as long as possible. Later, the pilot was cleared for the approach. At that time, the weather at Truckee was winds calm, 1/2 mile visibility, and snow. Clouds were scattered at 300 feet and overcast at 700 feet. The temperature and dew point were both -1 degree Celsius. As you may recall, the minimums for this approach are 1 mile visibility, and the MDA is 582 feet AGL. So the clouds were approximately 120 feet above minimums, and the visibility was 1/2 mile less than the required minimums. 2 minutes before the accident, the weather improved slightly to 3/4 mile visibility and light snow and 900 feet overcast. So the reported visibility was still 1/4 mile less than the minimums for the approach. As you probably know, pilots flying under Part 91 for personal flying are allowed to fly an approach when it's below minimums. Thus, they're allowed to take a peek to see if they can see the airport and can try to land. But as you can imagine, this places enormous pressure on the pilot to consider cheating by flying lower than permitted in hopes of spotting the runway. And that's why Part 135 Charter and Part 121 airlines are not permitted to fly an approach when it's below minimums, because the temptation to cheat is just so great, and because the FAA doesn't want to put paying passengers' lives at risk. Ironically, those professional pilots would probably be more qualified than most Part 91 pilots to fly an approach to near minimums. But regardless, it's we, the generally less capable Part 91 pilots, who are the only ones permitted to fly an approach when it's below minimums. Of course, if when we arrive, the weather is still below minimums, we're not permitted to land and we must fly the published missed approach. The tower at Truckee closed at 6 p.m., about 37 minutes before the crash. So while on the approach, ATC switched the pilot to the advisory frequency. Oddly, the pilot never made an announcement on the advisory frequency, though we can hear a number of clicks on the CTAF, which was probably the pilot turning on the runway lights. The official sunset time was 7:23 p.m., so technically it was still daylight. But as you know, when it's snowing, the sky is somewhat darker. And while the runway lights might have been of some help at night, they probably didn't help the pilot much, as he was looking for the runway through snow with visibility between 1/2 and 3/4 of a mile. The barometric pressure at the time of the accident was 29.66, but ADS-B data transmits pressure altitude. So to know the pilot's actual altitude, we need to subtract 260 feet from the uncorrected ADS-B baro altitudes that you may see online. And here's how we know the pilot was using the autopilot while on approach. Some aircraft, typically those with more modern avionics, transmit the mode that the autopilot is operating in. So in this case, from data on adsbexchange.com, we can see that when the aircraft was on the final segment of the approach, it was displaying autopilot, VNAV, approach, and LNAV, indicating that the autopilot was on and that it was performing both lateral and vertical navigation using the autopilot's approach mode. This is significant as it tells us the aircraft was set up to couple to the approach's advisory glide slope. My thanks to Dan Stoifert at adsbexchange.com for explaining that to me. Dan also pointed out that on one of the last data points captured by ADS-B Exchange, which was prior to the missed approach point, the pilot changed his selected altitude from 9,500 feet to 6,400 feet, 80 feet below the published minimums for the approach. FlightRadar24.com captured flight data throughout the flight, including the minimum altitude flown on the approach of 6,475 feet. Correcting that altitude yields a figure of 6,215 feet. The site also showed a minimum GPS altitude of 6,275 feet. That means that the pilot went somewhere between 200 and 250 feet below the MDA, and that would be permitted if the pilot had the airport in sight and had decided to land. However, the plane never turned toward the runway, so it's unlikely the pilot saw the airport. Instead, the airplane followed the final approach course, which at the threshold had the pilot about 0.2 nautical miles left of the runway. Moreover, the pilot did not initiate the missed approach procedure at the missed approach point, 0.8 nautical miles before the runway. The missed approach called for an immediate climbing right turn to Griot on a track of 016, a turn of about 200 degrees, sending the aircraft back in the direction from which it came. Somewhere around the threshold, the pilot pitched up sharply, quickly gaining about 500 feet of altitude while climbing briefly at about 2,000 feet per minute. However, The pilot still had not started the right turn. These two facts suggest strongly that the pilot was now hand-flying the published missed approach. Oddly, this 500-foot jump in altitude was about all the altitude the pilot would gain while struggling to fly the published missed approach. The plane continued flying, mostly level at about 6,750 feet, plus or minus about 100 feet, for the next minute, when it should have been climbing to 12,000 feet. Since the aircraft leveled off instead of continuing to climb, it's possible the pilot decided to circle to land. However, the aircraft was nearly 500 feet below the Category B circling MDA of 7,220 feet. The roughly 200-degree turn was completed in about 40 seconds, whereas an autopilot flying a standard rate turn would have taken about 66 seconds, another indication the missed approach was being flown by hand. During this time, the pilot was likely cleaning up the aircraft, raising the flaps partially, then raising the landing gear, and then raising the rest of the flaps. He may also have had to unsuspend the FMS system so that he could fly the missed approach, which he probably did using the toga button or the takeoff go-around button. After the aircraft jumped up 500 feet and leveled, it started its right turn about 1.3 miles beyond the missed approach point where the turn should have begun. The aircraft remained mostly level throughout the turn and rolled out on a heading of about 010, which was fairly close to the heading required for the missed. Simultaneous with the rollout on the correct heading, the aircraft pitched up again sharply and started climbing again at about 2,200 feet per minute. After climbing about 350 feet, it rolled to the left and started descending rapidly. From the data, it's apparent that the aircraft stalled and began a rapid descent at over 6,400 feet per minute. The airplane crashed about a half mile north of the runway 11 numbers, killing the pilot and passenger. Now let's go back to the beginning. Thinking about this flight, did you think of any potential decision-based errors? And you could certainly argue whether it was an error or not, though the few pilots I talked to after the crash felt that it was. As I was thinking about this accident, I recalled flying in a Vision jet with a client years ago who was advocating a very risky night landing on a short runway in a rural area with few lights on a runway that was about 50% clear of snow. And we knew that as we talked with the airport owner via sat phone from the plane, and I could tell that he was strongly urging that we not attempt a landing. But the owner still wanted to do it. So I asked the pilot, do we have any good alternatives? And he proposed that we land at another airport that was larger, well-lit, and which had fully cleared its runways of snow. It was a good decision, but it took a lot of discussion to reach that point. The owner really wanted to land at that airport since it was next to the town where he had business the following day. You've probably heard of get-home-itis or get-there-itis, which you might also call planned continuation bias. And like me, you were totally convinced that it could never happen to you. And yet it did happen to me once. I completely underestimated the power of a crying 2-year-old on my decision-making. And if you want to hear about my near-fatal icing incident, I encourage you to listen to episode 227, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/227. In this accident, the pilot was headed back to his home base of Truckee Airport from where he could drive to Incline Village in perhaps 25 minutes. But were there any good alternatives? If you know the area well, you know the city of Reno, Nevada is just 20 nautical miles northeast of Truckee. Best of all, the weather is usually different there as it's in a broad valley, and its field elevation is about 1,500 feet lower than Truckee. Both places can get bad weather, but often the weather is significantly better at one airport than the other. In this case, the weather at Reno was a lot better. About 15 minutes before the accident, the weather at Reno was winds 280 at 13, 5 knots visibility and light rain and mist, with clouds scattered at 1,000, broken at 2,300 feet, and overcast at 3,500 feet. To me, the decision was clear. Under the circumstances, a landing at Reno would have been easier with a little stress versus flying an approach into Truckee under the most difficult of circumstances. Coincidentally, I made that same exact decision to divert under very similar circumstances just a couple of months ago between the same two airports. I've been flying a lot lately with a pilot who purchased a share of a Vision jet, and we were set to fly to Truckee as he was going to spend some time, coincidentally, in Incline Village. On the day of the flight, both he and I independently came to the decision that we would be better off landing in Reno instead of Truckee. And the weather at Truckee, while not great, was significantly better than it was when this accident occurred. Still, neither of us wanted to fly an approach into Truckee with poor weather when there was such an easy approach to be made just 20 miles away. The only real downside of making that choice was that the owner's drive to Incline Village was 20 minutes longer from Reno than it would have been from Truckee. And here's a note I got from another client of mine yesterday who was planning to fly into Truckee at about the same time as the accident pilot. He wrote, "Hey Max, sad to see another Truckee crash. I canned my planned 206 trip Friday to Truckee because of the storms and icing. Instead, on Saturday, we actually diverted to/landed at Reno in my friend's Pilatus PC-12 about 20 minutes before the crash. That flight was smooth with zero icing at flight level 190 and a broken layer at about 3,000 with good visibility and no snow. Contrast that with Truckee, where we drove to pick up our cars, where the visibility was definitely less than the half-mile advertised IFR conditions. My guess is that it was about 500 to 750 feet visibility, felt like freezing fog, and it was snowing moderately hard." So why didn't this accident pilot divert to Reno as well? We'll probably never know for sure. And indeed, there may be times when it does make sense to fly an approach, even when the weather is at or below minimums, so not everyone would agree that it was an error for the accident pilot to fly the approach into Truckee instead of diverting to Reno. For example, AWOS information is sometimes unreliable, and so it might make sense to fly an approach when there's a known issue with the accuracy of weather reporting at a particular airport. But if you do it, you want to make sure you fly the approach exactly as published and not dip below minimums, and start the minimum approach promptly at the missed approach point. Also, there are a variety of reasons that pilots may sometimes feel compelled to complete a flight despite the known risk. First, they may feel inconvenienced if they divert to another airport. Most likely their car is waiting for them at the airport, and landing at another airport will involve getting a taxi or an Uber or renting a car at the airport to which they diverted so they can drive to their original destination to get their car. And then, in a day or two, they'll need to go back to the diversion airport, get the plane and relocate it to the intended destination, and that entire process will take more than a few hours. 2, pilots may have personal or professional commitments awaiting them at their destination, leading to a strong desire to complete the flight. Or they may have time constraints, such as the need to return home before a certain time. 3, a pilot may feel overly confident in their abilities, leading them to underestimate risks and overestimate their capability to handle challenging situations. This may be more likely when landing at airports with which they're more familiar. 4, pilots may feel pressure from passengers or other crew members to complete a flight, or may feel self-induced pressure to not let passengers down. 5, pilots may feel that they have limited alternatives, such as no nearby airports for diversion, or inadequate resources for an extended stay, which can encourage them to press on with the flight. And finally, 6, pilots may seek to avoid the higher costs they may incur by diverting to another airport. And then there's planned continuation bias. If you've just flown over 1,000 miles for 3 hours and you're 98% of the way home, it's really, really difficult for pilots to not think, well, the first part of the trip went well. If I can just make it these last few miles, I'll get there. And on top of that, I think most pilots are optimists. I mean, we engage in flying for fun or as a profession when objectively we know there's some chance that we could get killed in an airplane. And if the weather is poor, we know that weather is always changing. And as optimists, we're more likely to expect the weather to stay the same or improve rather than get worse. So I believe it's hard for pilots to deviate from a plan that's working well when there's a chance that it could still work out. For example, what if you flew to Reno and then discovered that the weather had gotten better at Truckee? Would you feel bad about that? I wouldn't, and I hope you wouldn't either, because once you make a good decision that reduces risk, it doesn't matter what the actual outcome would have been if you'd had continued to your original destination. Note that this pilot flew the instrument approach more or less successfully, and the approach is the part that most pilots think about when contemplating whether to fly an approach near minimums. However, it's not the approach, but rather the missed approach that can be significantly more challenging and hence more risky when flying to minimums. We'll talk more about missed approaches in a moment, but let's talk about a technical reason that this aircraft may have ended up over 200 feet low on the approach. I mentioned that the RNAV GPS 20 approach has LP minimums, and that the approach comes in at an angle to the runway. Some approaches with LP minimums also have an advisory glide slope, often called a plus V, And this approach at Truckee does have an advisory glide slope. And if you'd like to learn more about advisory glide slopes, I highly recommend episode 233 called What You Need to Know About Advisory Glide Slopes, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/233. An important thing to know about advisory glide slopes is that every autopilot I've seen, including the one in the G3000 avionics used in the TBM 960, treats an advisory glide slope the same way it treats an ILS glide slope. With an ILS, or an RNAV approach with LPV minimums, you have a DA or decision altitude, which means that as you reach the minimum altitude, you must decide whether to go around or land. And the FAA permits an aircraft to descend slightly below those minimums in the couple of seconds it takes you to make that decision. To accommodate that, autopilots are designed to not level off at the minimums when they're coupled to a glide slope. But an LP approach has an MDA, or minimum descent altitude. With an MDA, you must level off at the minimums, and you are permitted to continue flying toward the missed approach point. So you cannot go below the MDA, even by 1 foot, unless you have the runway environment in sight and decide to land. Before the advent of advisory glide slopes, autopilots would level off at an MDA. But unfortunately, I've yet to see an autopilot that can distinguish between a glide slope for a DA and an advisory glide slope for an MDA. And Garmin, if you're listening, please consider adding this to your list of future features. Every autopilot I've seen, when coupled to an advisory glide slope, will let an aircraft descend through the MDA, which has surprised many pilots I've flown with. So in the case of the accident aircraft, it's possible the pilot didn't realize that his aircraft wouldn't level off at the MDA, but would continue to descend through the minimums when the autopilot was coupled to an advisory glide slope. It's apparent from the data that the pilot was using the autopilot on the approach, but that the missed approach was clearly hand-flown. So in this case, I think it's most likely that the pilot was searching for the runway and didn't notice that the autopilot took him through the MDA. He was probably shocked when he noticed that the aircraft was over 200 feet low on the approach, and then did what we teach pilots to do when the autopilot isn't doing what you want, which is to disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the plane. Though in this case, a better solution might have been to push the toga button and push the thrust lever all the way forward, which would have put the aircraft in a stable climb. Or it's possible that the pilot purposely allowed the aircraft to get low to increase his chances of spotting the runway. But that seems less likely, as the sudden rapid climb seems more indicative of a startle reaction than of a deliberate plan to fly below minimums. Or perhaps the pilot spotted the airport and continued to get low to land, though this seems unlikely as he never turned toward the runway. I do want to pass along 2 tips for flying with an autopilot coupled to an advisory glide slope. Since the autopilot will not level off at the MDA, you need a strategy for forcing the autopilot to level off at the MDA. One is to disconnect and hand fly the aircraft when you reach the MDA, which I don't recommend. Another strategy is to monitor your altitude, and just as you reach the MDA, push the Alt button on the autopilot, which will force the autopilot to level off and prevent it from following the advisory glide slope through the MDA. I used to use that strategy, but the downside is that it forces you to constantly monitor your altitude, and if you get distracted and forget to push the Alt key, you will descend below the MDA. A better strategy, which I now use and recommend, is to push the autopilot's vertical speed button when you're still a few hundred feet above the MDA. When you do that, the autopilot will capture your current descent rate, say 500 or 600 feet per minute, and it will continue to descend at that rate in vertical speed mode. And when you reach the MDA, the aircraft will level off. Also, you may recall that the ADS-B data shows that the pilot set the selected altitude to 6,400 feet on the final segment of the approach. This may have caused another issue that I occasionally see. Since the aircraft went more than 100 feet below that altitude, if the pilot followed the standard of procedures, which is to leave the autopilot on and push the toga button at minimums and then push the thrust lever all the way forward for the go-around, the aircraft would have climbed briefly and then leveled off at 6,400 feet. Oddly, when I've seen this happen, I often have to point it out to a pilot, as they haven't noticed that the aircraft unexpectedly leveled off near minimums. It is now accelerating level just a few hundred feet above the ground. If this happened to the accident pilot, it's probably why he disconnected the autopilot. In general, when planning to couple to a glide slope or a GPS glide path on an approach with a DA, I recommend that pilots not have the altitude selector set to minimums. Instead, They should set it to the missed approach hold altitude. There's no need to set it to minimums, since modern aircraft can be set up to give an audible alert when you reach the minimums. And setting the altitude selector to minimums won't cause the aircraft to level off at the DA. So when there is a DA, there's zero benefit to setting the altitude selector to minimums, and doing so sets you up for an aborted climb-out that stops at the altitude at which you set the altitude selector. But my recommendation on whether to set the altitude selector to minimums when coupled to an advisory glide slope, such as the one on the approach flown at Truckee, is a little more complicated. If you use either of the first two methods that I mentioned for leveling off at the MDA, which were disconnecting the autopilot at minimums to hand fly the aircraft, or pushing the autopilot's alt key at minimums, then you shouldn't set the altitude selector to minimums. You should set it to the missed approach hold altitude. But if you use the method I prefer, which is after the autopilot has coupled to the advisory glide slope, you push the autopilot's vertical speed button when you're a few hundred feet above the MDA. You have to set the altitude selector to minimums for that method to work. And if you do use that method and later push the toga button and add power, the aircraft will start a climb and won't unexpectedly level off at the minimums. It won't level off because you're not starting the climb from below the minimum altitude set on the altitude selector. Instead, you're starting it at the minimum altitude. Now let's talk about the aircraft's sudden climb at the beginning of the missed approach, in which it gained about 500 feet very quickly before leveling off. I've seen this before when flying with clients in similar circumstances. Here's why it's so common. When flying an instrument approach or when on a final for a normal landing, a pilot usually trims the aircraft for a particular airspeed. When properly trimmed, an aircraft will remain at approximately the same airspeed even when the power is changed. So what can happen at the beginning of a missed approach, or as the pilot initiates a go-around before a landing, is that when the pilot adds power, the properly trimmed aircraft tries to remain at the same airspeed. And the only way that most airplanes can remain at the same airspeed is to pitch up dramatically. This is particularly strong when simulating an emergency approach to landing with the power off and the aircraft trimmed to the best glide speed. When you finish the maneuver and add full power to go around, you'll get a dramatic pitch up of the aircraft as the aircraft tries to remain at the best glide speed for which the aircraft is trimmed. Savvy pilots know that when adding lots of power, they need to simultaneously add lots of forward pressure on the yoke to prevent the aircraft from pitching up to a dangerously high pitch attitude. And if you push the throttle or thrust lever forward very quickly, you'll get an even more dramatic pitch up. This is one reason I coach my clients to add power over 2 to 3 seconds rather than jamming the throttle or thrust lever forward quickly. And when you're in IMC, this problem is exacerbated since you can't see a horizon outside, and you won't get external visual feedback that the aircraft is pitched too high. Obviously, if you're looking inside at the attitude indicator, it will be clear that the aircraft is pitched too high. Now let's talk about why flying a missed approach at minimums is more complicated and more risky than flying the approach itself to minimums. First, once you're on an instrument approach, the last part of the approach is relatively simple, especially if you're using an autopilot coupled to a glide slope or a GPS glide path. Essentially, at that point, you're just monitoring the approach to make sure nothing goes wrong. From a workload standpoint, it's relatively easy until you get to the point where you need to initiate the missed approach. By contrast, at the missed approach point, you have a change in power, a change in aircraft pitch, a change in aircraft configuration with gear and flaps, and you have a change in navigation, which often requires some interaction with the FMS system. In short, you have a very heavy workload, as there's a lot you need to do, all the while remaining mindful that all of this is happening close to the ground where there's less margin for error. Put this in perspective, let me share a comment an airline pilot friend made to me a few years ago. He said airline pilots rarely have to perform a go-around for real, and when they do, they almost always perform some part of that procedure incorrectly. That's because there are a number of steps they have to perform, and because they may only perform it in the simulator once every 6 or 12 months. Granted, we typically have fewer steps to perform in a GA aircraft, but if the pros are getting it wrong, that tells you that this is a complicated procedure that's easy to mess up, especially if you're feeling the stress of performing it in bad weather close to the ground. So arguably, flying a missed approach is more difficult than flying the instrument approach itself. But which do we practice more? flying instrument approaches, or flying missed approaches. In general, pilots fly far more instrument approaches than missed approaches, even though the latter is more difficult. And when you do fly a missed approach, what percentage of the time is it done with an instructor or a second pilot on board versus doing it by yourself? My guess is that for most pilots, relatively few of the missed approaches they've performed have been as a single pilot without a second pilot or an instructor on board. And I'm guessing most pilots have flown relatively few single pilot approaches in their career where they had to go missed because weather was below minimums. And when they did, I'm guessing the stress level was significantly higher than when they had a second pilot or CFI on board. Frankly, I've flown a number of approaches where we had to go missed because we couldn't see the runway. But in every case, I was the instructor on board and we did it for training purposes. And since it was from training, we didn't have a compelling reason to land at the airport, so we had no incentive to fly below the minimum altitude or to continue the approach beyond the missed approach point, seeking to find the airport, as we didn't intend to land. And we did it at airports where it was relatively flat, where there were far fewer terrain considerations than there are at Truckee. So while you may feel confident that you can successfully fly a single pilot approach to minimums, are you equally confident about your abilities to manage the much higher workload of flying a missed approach when the weather is at or below minimums? And is that confidence possibly misplaced? Or have you been doing the work and regularly performing or practicing missed approaches by yourself without an instructor on board? And note that unless you're in a simulator, the only way you could practice this in simulated instrument conditions without an instructor on board is with another pilot on board serving as a safety pilot or in larger aircraft as a required crew member. So it's difficult to get the opportunity to practice flying a missed approach for real as a single pilot unless you're actually on an approach in IMC. I'm not going to list all of the steps required for performing a missed approach, but I do want to mention that the Garmin G3000, about which I've written a book and which is used in the TBM 960 and in the Vision Jet in which I teach, automates many of these tasks, reducing the workload required for a go-around. In most aircraft, a pilot is required to disconnect the autopilot at the missed approach point and then must initially hand fly the beginning of the missed approach before re-engaging the autopilot. But starting in about 2009, Cirrus was the first GA manufacturer that I know of that had a system, the Cirrus Perspective, which is their version of the Garmin G1000, which allowed a pilot to leave the autopilot on throughout the entire instrument approach and the missed approach. Yes, there was still some button pushing required, but you never had to disconnect the autopilot, which significantly enhanced safety when flying a missed approach. Not surprisingly, the TBM 960 and the Vision Jet have a similar capability. However, you only get the full benefits of this automation if you leave the autopilot on. In this case, however, the accident pilot apparently disconnected the autopilot after he went about 200 feet below minimums, so he didn't have the benefits of this automation, which significantly increased his workload as he began flying the published missed approach. Now let's talk about the final moments of the flight. I mentioned that the aircraft began its climb out rapidly, gained about 500 feet, and then leveled off while the pilot was turning to the heading required for the missed approach. During that brief initial climb, the ground speed dropped from about 110 knots to 101 knots, which you'd expect from such a rapid climb. Throughout the turn, the ground speed increased to about 155 knots and then stayed around that airspeed. That suggests that after the initial pitch-up, the pilot reduced the power, otherwise we would have seen the aircraft accelerate much more while level in the turn. After completing the turn, the aircraft made a second sharp climb, gaining another 350 feet before apparently stalling. Most likely that occurred because the pilot was still hand-flying, advanced the thrust lever forward to a high power setting, and the aircraft again pitched up sharply as it tried to remain at the airspeed at which it was trimmed. Now, there are a couple of other possibilities, though I think they're less likely. One is that the aircraft had picked up a heavy load of ice during the descent and stalled as it pitched up. I think that's unlikely as the aircraft was over 40 knots faster than it was during its first fast climb. If it were going to stall because of a heavy load of ice, I would have expected it to happen during the first climb. Another possibility is that the pilot raised the flaps to flaps 0 about the time he started the climb, and that with a heavy load of ice, this induced the aircraft to stall at a higher speed than it would have with the flaps extended. The POH for the TBM 940, the model prior to the 960, does have a procedure for exiting severe icing, and one step in that procedure says that if flaps are extended, do not retract them until the airframe is clear of ice. Regardless of whether ice was involved, I believe the probable cause will ultimately say that the pilot had a loss of control after exceeding the critical angle of attack and stalling. By the way, when I searched the NTSB database for TBM accidents since the year 2000, I found a total of 23 fatal accidents, about one per year. And most of the recent fatal TBM accidents involved a loss of control. Some of these recent accidents included November 2023, Ludington, Michigan. The preliminary report says the pilot took off in 3/4 mile visibility and 400 feet ceiling and crashed 1/4 mile from the airport. August 2021, Urbana, Ohio, probable cause, the pilot's failure to arrest the aircraft's left roll and rapid descent for reasons that could not be determined. October 2020, Corfu, New York, probable cause, the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane for undetermined reasons during the descent to the destination airport. October 2019, Lansing, Michigan, probable cause, the pilot's failure to maintain airspeed during final approach, which resulted in a loss of control and an aerodynamic stall at a low altitude. February 2018, Evanston, Wyoming, probable cause, the pilot's loss of control due to spatial disorientation. Now, of course, loss of control accidents are among the most common types of accidents for all aircraft, so we shouldn't conclude that TBMs are any more likely to have loss of control accidents than other aircraft types. I also want to mention Garmin's Autoland capability, which is available in a small number of aircraft, including the TBM 960 and later models of the Cirrus Vision Jet. I was at the Garmin factory the day they announced this new capability in 2021, and let me read a small part of what I've written about Autoland in my G3000 book. As currently implemented, it's only for emergency use. A typical use case is if a pilot becomes incapacitated, a passenger can push a button to initiate the Autoland sequence. Autoland takes many factors into consideration before selecting the airport and runway at which it will land. These factors include weather, fuel on board, runway surface, length and width, terrain, obstacles, and more. Autoland then uses a discrete set of attributes to characterize each potential airport. Now, as I said, the TBM 960 is equipped with Autoland, which they call home safe, and at virtually any point during the approach or missed approach, the accident pilot could have pushed the home safe button and it would have chosen an airport, probably Reno, and automatically landed the aircraft. Though I don't know if the system would have worked once the aircraft stalled and was headed for the ground. But using the system probably never crossed the pilot's mind, and I wouldn't have thought of it either, even though I've written about it and the capabilities available in some of the Vision jets I fly. Part of the problem is that there is no way to practice using the system, so pilots don't build the muscle memory to think about using it. Another problem is that all of the marketing material that I've read about it is focused on a pilot incapacitation scenario. Here's what it says on the Daher website, quote, "The TBM 960's home safe emergency Autoland function automatically brings the airplane to a runway touchdown if the pilot is incapacitated. This game-changing technology extends Daher's innovation to a feature that specifically addresses safety from the passenger's point of view." So while I think Garmin's Autoland is a wonderful life-saving technology, and I am in awe of the engineers who created it, I think there's more work to be done. Pilots need to be able to practice using the system, which they currently aren't allowed to do. And Garmin and the OEMs such as Cirrus and Daher should start talking about other use cases for the system and include situations in which pilots are overloaded and unable to keep up with the tasks they need to perform. Autoland is a potentially life-saving technology, and we need to let pilots practice using it in various scenarios. I also want to mention that the Truckee Airport has a significantly higher accident rate than other airports. And by the way, this is not the fault of airport management. I've met some of their staff and have been impressed with what they've done with the airport. Just one example, I think they've set the standard when it comes to publishing traffic pattern and noise abatement procedures on their website. I've never seen another airport that comes even close to the quality of their documentation. So if you're involved with operating an airport, I'd encourage you to go to truckeetahoeairport.com/aviation/procedures, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. While I do love the Truckee Airport, there's just nothing they can do about the high terrain, the high density altitude in the summertime, and the severe weather. Just for a quick comparison, I compared Truckee with my home airport of Palo Alto. Now, please don't contact me and tell me that's not a fair comparison, as there is no fair comparison. But this comparison is relevant as many pilots from my airport fly to Truckee, and many of the accidents in the Lake Tahoe region involve pilots who've flown there from the San Francisco Bay Area. I searched the NTSB database for accidents since the year 2000. It shows 42 total accidents for Truckee, almost 2 per year, and there have been 10 fatal accidents, about 1 every other year. By contrast, at Palo Alto, I found 27 accidents since 2000, a little over 1 per year, but just 2 fatal accidents. Now let's compare the number of operations at both airports. Palo Alto used to have about 190,000 operations per year, though in the most recent year they reported about 155,000 operations, so we'll use that number. According to a March 2024 board meeting, Truckee Tahoe Airport conducts roughly 35,000 operations per year. When you run the numbers for the past 20 years, Palo Alto has about 1 accident for every 101,000 operations, and it had 1 fatal accident for every 1.3 million operations. By contrast, for the past 20 years, Truckee has had 1 accident for every 20,000 operations, a rate 5 times higher than at Palo Alto, and it's had 1 fatal accident for about every 84,000 operations, 16 times higher than Palo Alto. Now, you could argue the numbers a little, but no matter how you cut it, these 2 towered airports have remarkably different accident rates, highlighting just how challenging it is to fly in and out of Truckee. By the way, I didn't know that the accident rates were this different until I calculated them yesterday, but I did have an intuitive feel that the accident rate for Truckee was higher. 2 weeks ago, when I was in USC's Aviation Human Factors course, the instructors introduced a concept they called build an accident. What they meant by that was that flight departments should look at existing safety data for their company and predict the next accident that would occur within their flight department. And then they should take steps to try to prevent this accident from happening. They then ask each of us in the class to build an accident for our company. Now, I don't work for a company. I'm an independent CFI, but I did do the exercise for the flying club where I teach most often. And here's what I came up with in the class. And remember, this was a week before this most recent accident. I said the club's next accident would involve a pilot with fewer than 250 hours of flying time taking off from the Truckee Airport during the winter months on a Sunday at 6 p.m. I said it would occur at night under dark conditions with no moon. I said the pilots would have foolishly topped off their tanks, putting them at a higher gross weight, and that this would be in a Cessna 172 or 182 with 2 or 3 people on board, or that it might have been a VMC into IMC accident. Recommendations on how to prevent the accident might be to not permit night takeoffs in the mountains at near max gross weight. Building an accident is a powerful concept for any flight department as well as for an individual pilot. So you may want to spend some time thinking about the next accident or incident in which you could become involved and take steps to reduce the chances of that accident ever occurring. As we wrap up, one thing you might consider is whether there are any circumstances under which you take a look and fly an instrument approach when the weather is below approach minimums. As a Part 91 pilot, the FAA allows you to do that, and you might get lucky. The weather might be better than reported, and you might get to land. Or you might be unlucky, make a mistake while flying the approach or the missed approach, and have an accident. Let me ask you this. As a pilot, do you hold yourself to the highest possible safety standards when flying? And if the answer is yes, then why wouldn't you follow the FAA's more conservative rules for Part 135 and Part 125 carriers, which are not permitted to start an approach when an airport is below minimums? I mean, after all, isn't your life as valuable as the lives of passengers flying on those aircraft? If so, then commit now that you won't fly an approach when the weather is below minimums. Remember that as pilots, we try to build extra margin around every activity we do. It's the reason I tell pilots to stay 300 feet below a Class Bravo or Class Charlie shelf, or at least half a mile laterally from restricted airspace. Why? Because all pilots make mistakes, and I want some margin in case a pilot starts getting too close to airspace. And remember that if you fly an approach to minimums, and then you have to fly the published missed approach, you've put yourself into a stressful, high workload situation. And in a situation like that, there's little margin for error. Sometimes in life, the workload exceeds our capabilities for handling it. Finally, all of us as pilots will make mistakes, usually at least one on every flight. So why put yourself in a situation where the margins are so slim that there's no room to accommodate a single error? Like RC pilots fly their model planes at an altitude that is at least 2 mistakes high, we want to always leave sufficient margin so that even when we make a mistake or two, there's margin to recover from that mistake. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down. You can always